Welcome to Intended Consequences, the official podcast of the Strategy Corp Institute of Public Policy and Economy. I'm your host, Mitch Davidson. Today, we're joined by Professor Christopher Sands for the second of two episodes covering the U.S. election and its policy implications for Canada. Professor Sands, as you know from last week, is the director of the Canada Institute at the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars and professor of Canadian Studies at Johns Hopkins University. Professor, thanks for coming on for the second time after the election.
It's a pleasure.
So, we have to do a little bit of table setting up front again, because when we recorded the first episode, we were in, let's call it presidential limbo, where we had a good idea of what the results were going to be, but we didn't know for sure. And even though we're still probably in some form of presidential limbo, we at least have a presidential candidate, and that is Vice President Joe Biden has gotten to shed the vice moniker from his title and will now, barring any legal battles, be sworn in as the next president of the United States. So we can now focus a bit on this specific administration and what it means moving forwards. And with the Joe Biden presidency comes a lot of new policy initiatives, a lot of new direction, and certainly a new tone. Before we really dive into what policies we can expect to see, I want to ask you about something that you commented on recently in a conversation with me, and that's how hard it might be to see some of these policies through. You've noted that Congress over the past 4 years relinquished a lot of authority to the president in the form of presidential orders and those sorts of things where they didn't necessarily fight. And you've mentioned the role of the Supreme Court. So I'm just kind of wondering, what's Congress's role in the next 4 years? Are they looking to take some of that power back? And how's that going to affect the Biden administration?
Yeah, to me, that's actually one of the more interesting dimensions. For so long, Congress has been the least loved of our institutions. And we had sort of low points like the Affordable Care Act, probably one of the more significant pieces of legislation of the last 20 years, which was extremely long. And Speaker of the House, Nancy Pelosi, said, we'll have to pass it to see what's in it. It was more than anybody could read. And even with all those pages, left a lot to agency discretion to implement. And one of the big debates in American legal circles, led by Philip Hamburger, the law professor, who's written a book called Is Administrative Law Unconstitutional? A very large body of U.S. law now is the law underneath a statute of regulation. And one of the big issues you might have heard during Amy Coney Barrett's confirmation hearings right before the election for the Supreme Court was this debate about Chevron deference, which is not a reference to the oil company, although it is somewhat because they were the litigant in a case we think about now as Chevron, in which the Supreme Court ruled that in a matter of interpretation of regulation, the agency that promulgated the regulation should be given deference in sort of interpreting its own rules. And this has led to a lot of American governance being quite attenuated from democratic accountability. And as we think about the effect, which I think will be with us for a while, of populism and disdain for the establishment of the United States, this is one of the things that I think will be a battleground going forward. And part of that is how Congress rethinks its attitude toward legislation. We saw this, ironically, in 2015 when the Obama administration surprised a lot of its own fellow Democrats by asking Congress for trade promotion authority in order to negotiate the Trans-Pacific Partnership. And Barack Obama had long been a skeptic about trade agreements and globalization, and suddenly was asking for that permission. He got it, but it was the most constrained grant of trade negotiating authority that we'd seen since the 1974 Trade Act, which you probably don't remember, but it was Gerald Ford's signature achievement following Watergate, that he convinced Congress to agree to a process whereby they would have the opportunity to grant authority, but not to amend the agreement that came back as long as it met those requirements. And I had written a couple of pieces for the C.D. Howe Institute about how constraining those requirements were on the negotiation, because Donald Trump didn't think he could get a better deal out of Congress. And so he embraced the same grant of trade promotion authority himself. We're going to see that grant, by the way, expire this year or in 2021. So there's a very short window for President Biden to negotiate new trade agreements, maybe get into the TPP, but there's not going to be a lot of other time. But it's part and parcel of Congress pushing back and trying to claim its own processes and demand a little bit more respect for itself as an institution. I actually think it's self-respect that Congress often lacks, and it will be really important to see going ahead whether, if you will, the people's branch of government, the one in which popular opinion is most directly channeled in all of its diversity and cacophony, whether that can actually become a more functioning and more respected part of the U.S. constitutional order.
Yeah, and I think there's something that you mentioned the other day as well that I want to pick up on that, and that was the role of the Supreme Court in all this. And you actually, I think you mentioned the line that in some cases it's better to just get a court ruling, because then you at least you have jurisdictional clarity, you understand what the ins and outs are, and that's easier than going to Congress or dealing with the executive branch or any of these other things. So, what is the role of the Supreme Court? Is that evolving and changing, and does that particularly matter, or is it going to be a big roadblock to Biden as he looks to implement some of these agendas?
Funny thing, it's a topic that if you talk about it a certain way, it almost implies a position in the great wars over the court that we've had going back quite a long way. But I think maybe for many of your listeners, they'll remember Brown versus Board of Education, which led to the busing programs that Kamala Harris, when she was running, zinged Joe Biden for his position on way back when. But the desegregation of schools was done, probably the right thing to do, but it was done under a court order, which solved the problem for the Eisenhower administration of taking a position on something that for Southern Democrats was really a third rail for Southern Democratic politics. And later there was famously the Roe v. Wade decision on abortion, which for people who are strict constructionalists, the Constitution really doesn't say anything about that. But the court was able to come up with a way in which they felt that there was a right to abortion, and that changed American politics almost immediately. Something that had been moving through the federal system, different states agreeing to allow it under certain restrictions, other states saying no, very much the way Canada's legislation evolved in this area, kind of by baby steps, with Henry Morgenthaler making a big impact as a civil activist in Canada. But in the U.S., it was moving very slowly because it was a hot, contentious issue, and all of a sudden there was a ruling that gave a victory to one side, and it was a ruling that was ahead of where the mainstream of American politics was, and it showed just how much you could gain, not by convincing the majority of the country, not by convincing a political party or building a movement, but by focusing on a litigation campaign. And I know people feel very strongly about the Obergefell decision, which was relatively recent. Actually, many of your listeners will remember, which granted equality to same-sex marriages, at least in the eyes of the state. A decision that certainly also has no basis in the Constitution per se, but one which the court drew based on the commitments the Constitution makes in other areas to equality. So that's why I say, if you take a position on any of this and people say, well, if you challenge the court's legitimacy to make these decisions as a sort of super legislature, then you really don't approve of these progressive gains. You don't want schools to be desegregated, and you don't want women to have a right of choice. It's not really about that. I'd like to step back from that and just say that the court became the fast track to getting something done ahead of public opinion. And in a democracy, that short circuits a process by which people gradually move towards an idea. If you persuade them, if you have a lot of campaigns, you try to win them over. It takes a while, but I think we've been playing politics in a hurry. We're an impatient country in the United States. I think Canadians sometimes are as well, and we're impatient to get to a place where certain things are done, and so we're not doing things the old-fashioned way. We're trying to jump the queue with courts, and it's turned the courts in the United States into a much more political body. Not a confirmation goes by where a judge is either characterized as conservative or liberal, or more importantly, Republican or Democrat. And they've never had those kind of partisan leanings per se. That was never part of how they ran. I mean, you look at the Canadian Supreme Court, where you don't even have confirmation hearings. It's just a prime ministerially prime ministerial appointment, there is such respect for the institution. It's rarely said that individual judges are, conservatives or Bloc Québécois members. It's kind of left out because they don't bring that persona into the courtroom. But in the U.S., partly as a result of the tactics of people who are trying to do good but in a hurry, I think the courts become a very contentious part of our lives. And that's why when the Senate, when poor Ruth Bader Ginsburg passed away, people barely stopped to mourn her before they jumped onto the campaign to fight over who's going to take her place. And I think that it's one of the things that is also not working very well for the American system, and something I hope we can correct, but I'm not optimistic, unfortunately.
I partially asked the question because, there's been some noted legal battles over the role of states versus the federal government in terms of climate change, fuel standards, all those sorts of things. It's sort of, California a bit leading the charge on what power it does have. And so you see a lot of differentiation occurring there, specifically on climate change. And it's one where, obviously, President-elect Biden has put out quite the climate change plan, I think $2 trillion in climate change related measures. So, that's one where it seems like it could be interesting. It seems like there could be legal battles, but at least in terms of California and the president-elect, they're probably more aligned than anything these days now. As we turn this conversation a bit over to the role for Canada, let's start with climate change. Do you see a potential role for collaboration given the position of the two administrations right now? And do you see that as something that can be worked on moving forwards?
I actually do, and I hope that there are some people in the Biden administration who take some time to study not just the position of the government, but the experience of Canada in dealing with climate change thus far, because I think there are a lot of ideas that are still fairly underdeveloped in our national debates in the United States on things like carbon taxation. I mean, you'll find them in the academic literature for sure, but we haven't really started thinking about those kinds of levies. It's true that we're talking about another $2 trillion of stimulus. Last year we passed $2 trillion of stimulus, or actually earlier in 2020. And the fight at the very end of the Trump administration was between Congress, which wanted another two, and the president, who wanted only one. Voters seem to have decided two more would be good. But trillions of dollars. U.S. GDP is is north of $18 trillion, but it's a lot. It's still a lot of money, and spending all that in one go, especially when you're largely borrowing it, puts the country at risk. And of course, in an emergency, people say, well, don't worry about penny pinching. We've got a lot to do. But if you recall the 2008-2009 financial crisis, we started with the temporary troubled asset relief program, the TARP, which started under the George W. Bush administration, which sort of was in power at the very beginning of the financial crisis. And the TARP had some good success, but the Obama administration came in, and partly because they had run arguing that Bush hadn't done enough, they had to go one better. And they had a very large American Recovery and Reinvestment Act, which was premised on big investments in infrastructure, bailouts for the auto companies, quite a few other major expenditures. And it wasn't long, literally while the legislation was being debated in Congress, before critics said it's too much money and it's not going to boost the economy so much as it's going to pad the incomes of friends of the Obama administration, labor unions and others. And there was a bitter divide over it as Republicans in those days, quite deficit hawks, were complaining that this was really just pork spending and not really a sincere effort to turn the economy around. And of course, we later found out that, as President Obama said, there weren't as many shovel-ready projects as he thought, but there was a lot of money shoveled out the door. And in the process of debating that bill, Congress came to realize that they were losing public opinion, that people were cynical that the money wasn't really going to turn things around so much as it was going to take care of the better off members of the Democratic coalition. And this was when Congress decided to add Buy American provisions to the legislation. Buy American has a long tradition for the U.S. It signals to voters that although the money's going to get spent, it's going to get spent in the U.S. and there'll be, if you're a Republican, trickle down. I guess if you're a Democrat, trickle out. I'm not sure which direction the trickles go, but a sense that this will benefit people and that there will be jobs created out of it. And I see us going to ever more COVID response and finding ourselves needing to go back to those kinds of tropes. Buy American being something that Joe Biden has always been very sympathetic to in legislation and crises past. I can't see him not wanting it here. And given that the Congress is so tightly divided, House and Senate, you need every appeal possible to try to build a consensus. Nothing's possible without at least a few Republicans joining the Democrats or a few Democrats joining the Republicans. So I think it's going to be a challenge for Canada because this is a very national response, just as Canada's response has been national. And yet, I think most epidemiologists and sort of people in the medical profession say, well, there's no border in COVID, but we do have a border, and we're creating an us versus them or a us first, them later kind of discourse in American response to COVID, which is one that I think will make worse some of the feelings of in Canada about being on the outside, and will make actually recovery a little bit more difficult.
Mm-hmm. So on the trade part, on Buy America and the Canadian American economies being intertwined, a lot of the commentary to this point is talked about, certainly there's going to be a more stable hand based on or in the White House, just based on some of the actions of President Trump. Maybe we don't have to worry about things like the steel tariffs being put on sort of arbitrarily and having to respond as a Canadian government. But at the same time, there's a bit of a growing consensus that we're not going back to the old ways on trade. You mentioned on the last episode that the new NAFTA USMCA is the lay of the land, and it's the lay of the land for the Biden administration, law of the land rather, and it is that for the Biden administration as well. So, do you think Biden continues a bit of an aggressive approach on trade when it comes to Canada, or do you think he softens the discourse a bit?
I think it genuinely will be good news for Canada, not necessarily for other countries, but Canada and Mexico, and it was painful, took a risk to renegotiate NAFTA. I'm not sure they had a choice, but they embraced it and they tried to make the best of it. And now we have this agreement, which has been approved by all three countries and provides protection against new Section 232 tariffs on aluminum, steel, or anything else. There's a set of side letters to manage that. So I think Canada, looking back, now we go forward, was one of the lucky countries that got its market access to the United States secured before now, when it becomes almost impossible to imagine the United States negotiating a big trade agreement, let alone a WTO agreement. It's possible that President Biden will use, I think he has about 6 months in 2021. He might use that remaining authority to conclude the Trans-Pacific Partnership. I don't know whether we'll keep the comprehensive progressive part, but he might. But the TPP countries, the TPP 11, have always been quite eager to get the U.S. back in, not necessarily Donald Trump, but the U.S. So I think that is one deal that could be done. But the bigger deal, and one that Ottawa has been working very hard on the last couple of years, is the potential for a WTO round. The World Trade Organization has been operating on its foundation, which was the Uruguay Round Agreement, which the U.S. ratified in 1996. So it's quite almost as old as NAFTA was, and there must be problems with the WTO because every one of the candidates running for Director General has called for reform. So one way or the other. But I think the main problem is that the U.S. and China have been at loggerheads there, taking up an increasing number of the cases of the WTO, and often finding not resolution of their differences, but just sort of a worsening of them as they make their arguments, defend against each other, and we get another either inconclusive judgment or we get no judgment that leaves both sides sort of mad. Canada has been hoping, along with the European Union, that middle power countries and secondary players could pull the U.S. and China together and do a new round, maybe a speed round that would strengthen the WTO at this difficult time. I think it'd be hard for the Biden administration to embrace, and globalization will continue. If you think back to Bill Clinton's trade policy, Bill Clinton moved in a direction that was quite historic after NAFTA and the Uruguay round, which was that he called on developing countries to give up what remained of their protectionism, of their import substitution industrialization policies in exchange for export-led growth. They didn't have the domestic consumption capacity, particularly for higher end goods that were up the value chain that they needed in order to develop those industries. So the U.S. Pledged to open up its economy to international imports or exports into the United States, so that those countries could move up. And we saw from what we used to call the third world, and then they were the LDCs, the less developed countries. Suddenly we had a new discourse about emerging markets, about the BRICS, or the BRICS-SAM, as I think our friends at CG and Waterloo used to call it. We were thinking about lots of countries making relatively historic gains in their economic development. It was a really big deal. But what the Trump administration illustrated was that it came at a cost, and it came at a cost of a lot of American jobs in what are now declining industries. Joe Biden, I think, in this sense, was the smartest candidate or the best candidate for Democrats to pick to run in this election, because he has long had an appeal to blue collar workers, to the working class in the United States, a sort of empathy for their condition. And the fact that both Biden and Trump came relatively close to each other. This was not a blue or red wave. It was a very tight election on an appeal to the working class and to kind of making people feel that the president, one or two, would be a fighter for them. I think tells you something about how Americans are feeling about this. So coming out of COVID, are we any more interested in export-led growth for developing countries, or are we putting America first and we need to get our economy going? Canada's inside that Fortress America, thanks to USMCA. Canada will not be shut out, but a lot of other countries may be. And that's not really addressing yet the decoupling from China, which I think Donald Trump has started. Joe Biden will try perhaps to slow down or at least ease a little bit, but it's there's no guarantees that China, having realized its vulnerability to the U.S., if the U.S. really decides to play hardball, which Trump did, they may not be interested in recoupling in certain cases. And so it sets up a whole shift in the global political economy that will have profound consequences for Canada, not only in terms of its relationship with the U.S., which I think is in relatively good shape, and Mexico too, but its relationship with the rest of the world in a time of turmoil.
Yeah, I mean, I'm really glad you brought up China there, because there's a fascinating question to me about how President-elect Biden plays this game. You mentioned hardball from the Trump administration. I think we could all come to that conclusion, but where is he going to go on China relations? And when you're thinking about what it means for Canada, Canada's kind of like the United States is its older brother, and it just got in a fight in the schoolyard, and now Canada feels a little nervous walking around the playground about what might happen to it, right? Like it's not necessarily the one that started this all, but it's sort of got to deal with it. And we've got the two Michaels are in captivity. We've got issues with Canada-China relations as probably a direct result of what's going on south of the border. So for Canada, is this, to start, is it just kind of wait and see how this Biden-China relationship is going to develop? Or do you think there's an activist role that the country should try to be playing in maybe getting to a resolution or getting to a permanent stalemate?
Well, I feel as though the U.S.-China conflict, to put it in that sort of mild euphemistic term, is it is the great event, the great center of geopolitics right now. It's important to everyone everywhere on the planet how this is resolved. And I don't mean to be gloomy, but I don't think a war is off the table, unfortunately. The tensions can run high, and so I wouldn't put anything off the table. And in that environment, I think hoping for a breakthrough that puts us either back to the good old normal or on a track that is more constructive, I think is probably not in the near term cards. But everything we do from now until there's another U.S. president or another Chinese president has got to be very carefully calibrated. If I were advising Prime Minister Trudeau or Canadians generally, I would say that it's too important a moment to be passive about. You mentioned Michael Spavor and Michael Kovrig, who I saw in the Globe and Mail this morning, as the day that we're recording this. They'd been 700 days in captivity, and you may remember the Iran hostages only managed 444. So this is a pretty grim situation for them, and I know one that affects a lot of Canadians. But remember that the reason that they were arrested was in response to the arrest of Meng Wanzhou, who was arrested on a warrant from the United States, the premise of which was that she was involved as CFO in setting up a series of shell companies in order to do business in Iran in violation of U.S. Iran sanctions, which were imposed or reimposed when the Trump administration walked away from the Iran deal that the U.S., Canada, European countries had all been part of. And Joe Biden was a great supporter of that Iran deal and a big champion of it. And he still says it was the right deal and the best way to deal with Iran. So if Joe Biden believes that the Iran sanctions should never have been imposed, then his beef with Meng Wanzhou is different than the one that Trump would have had. And there is, I think, a potential deal in which the U.S. withdraws the warrant and extradition hearings stop and Meng Wanzhou is allowed to return to China. But that has to be done in such a way that the two Michaels come home. It has to be a quid pro quo. If the U.S. just sort of gives up and Canada sends Meng Wanzhou home and the Michaels don't come back, that's obviously not the way to play it. This is a valuable card that the U.S. can play, and as Joe Biden thinks about how he wants to approach this, because this will be a major gesture for the Chinese, showing that we're trying to de-escalate tensions on a marginal issue, not one that's at the heart of the relationship, but one that was important in the previous administration. He has to know, unlike Trump, who tended to play American cards and let the allies kind of fend for themselves, because of their pre-existing relationship, Trudeau and Biden need to talk right away about the potential for this kind of a deal and see what can be done to make it come off, because it would be, if nothing else, a humanitarian gain. I'm still skeptical of the Iranian regime, but in this matter, I think that deal would probably be the best for all concerned.
Yeah, so we've really taken it around the world here compared to last episode where we were focusing primarily on the election results. So I'm glad we're having a unique conversation here. And I'm gonna try a segue here, so bear with me. But part of that conversation between Trudeau and Biden, obviously about the role of China, synonymous to Buy America also means make things in America, right? Make more and more in America than perhaps was being done before, repatriating some of these supply lines. To do that, you've got to have access to resources. And so the Trump administration had pushed pretty aggressively on mineral development in North America, and Canada kind of signed on to this precious minerals list. Do you see that as something that continues? And primarily, I'm interested in, it's one thing to say, yeah, we have these minerals in our own backyard. It'd be great to go and get them and do all that kind of stuff. But at the same time, in order to develop them, you've got to be mining, you've got to be processing, you got to be doing things that aren't necessarily at all times harmonious with real pro-climate change policy. And to some extent, they might be antithetical to other types of industry within the United States. So I'm just curious about the sort of push and pull tendencies there of let's mine, let's process, let's also do a lot of stuff on climate change at the same time. Do you see this being a bit of a contradiction, or do you see a way in which those types of priorities can work together?
I do think that they can work together. And I'll just take a step back, because I think critical minerals or rare earths are one of those terms that, at least in Washington, I suspect Ottawa as well, has become kind of a buzzword that no one asks, what are you talking about? So these are things like lithium and cobalt, but also something called rare earths, which are very small metallic elements that are called rare because they are found in very tiny amounts throughout particular geological formations. So they are tricky to develop. They're expensive. It's not just any mining company or anybody with a shovel who can figure out how to get these things out. It's a real art for extractive industries to be able to figure out how to get these things out. Most of them have a toxic element because they're either radioactive or they have some potential, when concentrated, to be harmful for human health. So that adds to the cost for the miners. You have to be super careful as you develop them. And although we call them rare earths and critical minerals, they're actually somewhat common. They're available in North America, in parts of Africa, parts of South America. You can find quite a few of them in Russia and also in parts of China. And the Chinese government focused on these going back to the Obama years, in part because they are necessary for consumer electronics, everything from a cell phone to a video game system and computers. They're necessary for electric vehicles, and actually a lot of alternative energy requires some of these, including photovoltaic cells and others, where you really need these minerals, and we're counting on them. And then of course, the thing that always gets the U.S. going, which is defense technologies. A lot of these technologies require significant amounts of these minerals. But there were a lot on the global market, and during the commodity slump that followed the 2008-2009 financial crisis, China and state-owned companies from China invested in a number of the extraction companies and rights holders to develop these resources around the world. And they saw this as a strategic bet because they wanted to make sure that they would have access to these critical elements for their expansion of their military and also keeping up on consumer electronics. This all changed, at least our perception of it all changed in 2011, when after a dispute over the Senkaku Diaoyu Islands between Japan and China, China decided to unilaterally embargo Japan from receiving critical minerals. And it was a wake-up call to recognize that that control of these minerals could be used as a weapon. And Japan is obviously a very high-tech economy, very dependent on consumer electronics and other sectors. So it was a shock to them. And it started a discussion among Western allies about what to do about it. The problem is there's so much on the market that it doesn't make sense to go to northern Quebec or the Ring of Fire in Ontario or northern Alberta to pull these minerals out of the ground at great expense in a market which is saturated, except that if the Chinese decide to pull back on these minerals, the saturated market drains really quickly, and then all of a sudden they're hard to get. So the Trump administration made the decision that it was in the U.S. interest to develop alternative supplies, and if that meant national stockpiles, where the government would purchase and then warehouse large amounts of minerals that could be used for the military or for private industry in the case of a crisis, and designate that anything came from China could not go into that stockpile, then potentially you would have a secondary market. Almost the way that Prince Edward Island mussels distinguish themselves from everyday mussels because they have that little cachet of being from PEI. The idea was to create a kind of critical strategic mineral stockpile that was friendly to the West. And this would be worth a premium price. And that premium price would signal to markets that you should develop these resources. The Trudeau government, to their great credit, saw this and jumped on it. And last January 2020, signed a joint action plan for collaborative development of critical minerals. And the U.S. and Canada have been working towards that to eliminate barriers and ensure good communication. But this is my global tour d'horizon, but you raised the domestic political question. After, I guess, I don't know, it was Bill C-69. I don't know whether we call it C-69 still, but after Canada had a major projects legislation or review legislation that came out earlier or before the last Canadian election in 2019, I think a lot of people in the extractives industry felt that, and also in a lot of the development energy industry, like oil sands and so on, felt that Canada had so tied itself in knots with its review process in C-69 that there was no way to get to yes, or there was no certain path to get to yes on major projects. And because of the amount of money that would have to be invested to develop these critical minerals, a lot of companies aren't going to apply, even with the guarantee market that the Americans are going to buy a stockpile, which we haven't necessarily opened up yet. But if that were to happen, they'd like to be positioned. But if you can't get to yes, you're going to spend all this money in Canada. How do you make money? How do your shareholders respond when you're chasing windmills and hoping that the Canadians will come around? So the idea has been to talk about alternative energy, electric cars, some of the things that address climate change, for which these minerals are important to make a case that isn't so military oriented or just commerce oriented. And I don't think the Canadian debate is quite there. One last piece I think that is really important going forward on this, and that is that because the expertise in developing these things, in developing critical minerals extraction, is somewhat specialized, there are a couple of Canadian companies that could be contenders, but there are also a couple of companies that are not Canadian who'd have to come in as foreign direct investors, and how they would be treated and whether they would feel that they could get to yes, whether they feel like they could navigate relations with First Nations as needed, I think is a big question mark. And there's no guarantee that Canada will succeed in this development, but I think it's one of those things that people point to, even under the Trump-Trudeau era, where Canada was playing almost as critical a role as you did in NORAD, owning the real estate through which the Soviet bombers were going to come at Midwestern America. You know, your position is so good, and if you could make the most of that, you could get big concessions out of the U.S. and secure the partnership for a long time. But I think there are a lot of question marks about whether that will unfold.
Yeah, and to your point about, you got to expedite permits, you got to train workforces, you got to create processing facilities. Like, there are a lot of things to be done there, and so it's one thing to sort of sign an agreement and think about it, but at some point the governments, respectively, but particularly the Canadian government, has to make movements on that. One other thing I want to ask you is sort of the last episode before we let you go is, at the end of the podcast last time I mentioned that I was going to ask you about rural and urban issues. And so this is a bit of a segue. You mentioned electric vehicles and some of these climate change initiatives. I think one of the sort of unintended consequences, if I can go opposite of our podcast here, is that, a lot of these policies happen to be urban centric, right? You're talking about building new transit for people. You're talking about vehicles that have range anxiety, so you can't really use them if you're in really rural parts of the country. And at the same time, you've also got a Biden administration that has no choice but to think about how it wants to fight the pandemic. And again, that happens to be much more so an urban than a rural issue. And some of the particularly bad ramifications of the pandemic happen to hit urban, dense communities really hard. So is there a risk here, especially knowing the way that the electoral map seems to have wrinkled itself out, that the Biden administration, perhaps unintentionally so, puts forward a lot of things that kind of alienate rural America?
Well, maybe the best thing to say is, just as I get older, I can expect my face to keep wrinkling. I think we're going to see the wrinkling continue as so many of these changes that we're facing from, on the one hand, COVID, but on the other hand, new technology, are upsetting the balance of rural versus urban and suburban. They're changing the way that we think and live. And I'll talk about just a couple of these trends. So one of them is that for many people, COVID has meant that they have, rather than trying to have a small condo downtown, having a cottage or a second home or even a permanent home way out where the air is clear and they have a little bit more land around them to run around has become a priority since COVID. And you're seeing people who were typical urbanites looking at temporary location. If you have the means, a second home or cottage is nice, but even permanent relocation, we've discovered through this period of the pandemic that some, not everybody, but many of us are able to work at a great distance and telework. So that's opened up a different attitude about rural areas. For a long time, we saw our rural areas emptying out because the thing you could do out there, mining, logging, farming, was only going to employ so many people because of industrialization and mechanization and automation. So there was a limit to the available housing. You still see this in the Canadian North, where we're all worried about how COVID might affect the North because people have a housing deficit and people tend to pack into densely packed communities despite the great spaces out there. So that's the first thing. A second thing, and we talk about cars. Yes, it's true, electric cars have range anxiety, but one of the, to me, more interesting developments in the auto sector, very important in Ontario, are self-driving cars. And self-driving cars change your attitude about transportation because your underage kids can get to their soccer practice because a car can take them, and an elderly person in their golden years probably shouldn't be driving themselves, could get in a self-driving car and get to church or shopping, and so could live further out than they might be comfortable living now. A lot of those patterns are starting to shift. We've seen already in the United States, and I think Canada's seen this to a lesser degree, but still significant. We used to think of poverty as urban concentrated, But with gentrification, poverty is now existing in the suburbs. And I'll just talk a little bit about Washington, where I'm now. One of the things that came up in this election in Washington, D.C. is that demographically, although it has been a majority African-American city for a long time, it's now majority white. And it's majority white because of gentrification. And Democratic administrations, I'm not blaming the Obama administration, but during Democratic administrations, what the real estate people here will tell you is that Democrats like to live in the city and the Republicans like to live way, way out. And we saw a real premium put on living in the city, and but it's gentrified the city. And you can go to areas near where I live in Montgomery County or in Prince George's County, which are the suburbs to which the African-American middle class and many of the poor people in that community have moved in order to find affordable housing and half decent schools. But their pattern of getting around, their need for cars is different, right? So we would have thought people who were poor in the past could rely on the bus and they may not own a car. But now whether you're making a living on landscaping, childcare, education, whole range of service workers rely on a car to get from work site to work site. They're in the gig economy, but not on the higher end of it. And then, of course, you've got Uber and Lyft and all those other things. So our patterns of living are being transformed by the technology that's available. And COVID, in some ways, is exacerbating that. And the politics of that are important, too. California, we love California. They get away with things nobody else can do. They've had high taxes and some very expensive property taxes as well. And a lot of regulation, and they've been unable to solve problems with public sector pensions, particularly for teachers and healthcare workers. So they've seen strikes. They've tried to spend money on a multi-billion-dollar high-speed rail train that has turned into a multi-billion-dollar white elephant. And there's been an outflow of Californians to places like Nevada, Arizona, even Texas. Colorado. And as those people have moved from California, they took their politics with them. And so now we talk about Colorado as being a purple state, not really a Republican state as it was for many, many years, but one where John Hickenlooper, for example, could beat Cory Gardner as a senator for the U.S. Senate in this last election. Arizona, too. So the politics shift again because of people fleeing jurisdictions which for whatever reason, maybe because of policy problems, maybe because they're afraid California's going to have another earthquake. I don't know. But as people begin to shift and sort, our urban-rural tensions will take on a different feel. And there's certainly people who are newly arrived, like that old crazy show Green Acres with Zsa Zsa Gabor moving out to the countryside and having this glamorous accent and not knowing what to do with farmers and pigs and cows. That was the old joke, but increasingly those tensions are very real, except the poor are maybe stuck in the cities and the suburbs as well as in the rural areas, and the wealthy are in all three as well. So we're going to have to figure out a way to get along. But what you're talking about, both for Canada and the United States, is one of the most fascinating certainly economic and demographic changes of our lifetimes, but one which will have political implications as well. And we can guess at what those are going to be, but we may be surprised.
Yeah, I mean, to your point about the television show, I don't know how many Beverly Hillbillies we're seeing where we have the people out on the outskirts who are moving downtown. So, True. Yeah, I hear you. It seems to be a bit of a one-way equation right now, but I do think that shifting rural-urban landscape, it's a public policy issue up here, especially in the Greater Toronto area, that we're seeing en masse with this sort of flight out to rural parts, although they're about to potentially experience their first real Ontario winter. So we'll see how that holds up. But yeah, I think that's a conversation I could talk about all day. And on that point, we managed to do 2 full episodes, and I think we still have plenty to talk about. So with that, I just want to say thanks for taking the time to do this, not just today, but last week. And I think that having the 2 episodes, both before we knew the exact result of the presidential election, could focus a bit more electorally, and this one where we can think a bit more to the future has been really insightful. So, Chris, really appreciate you coming on again.
It's a pleasure. It's one of the most intelligent conversations I've participated in the last couple of weeks, and I credit you for that. So
well,
nice chatting with you.
I'll tell you quickly why it's the most educated. If you look at the ratio, I think you did about 75% of the talking. But I'll take the kind words, so I appreciate it.
All right. Thanks very much.
Thank you for listening to Intended Consequences, the official podcast of the Strategy Corps Institute of Public Policy and Economy, produced by Sarah Bordeaux and myself. Views expressed during this podcast are not necessarily the views of Strategy Corp. All rights to this episode are reserved, and guests on the podcast may be current or past clients of Strategy Corp. To find out more about the Institute and to subscribe to our written material, or to find past episodes of the podcast, please visit our website at www.strategycorp.com/institute. Until next time, I'm Mitch Davidson.